It's The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us, Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time Magazine. How are things?
Great. End of the week.
Things are great. Okay. She set a high bar. France 24 senior correspondent Catherine Norris-Trent is with us as well.
Bonsoir.
How are things on your end?
Yeah, pretty good. Vivian said end of the week. It feels a bit more like end of the world.
Does it feel like end of the world to Alexander Query, who joins us from Kharkiv, reporter at the Kyiv Independent?
So far, so good.
So far, so good. Okay. And from Geneva, Jamil Shad, columnist for Brazilian news portal UOL. Your books include Politics, Bribes, and Football. Good to see you.
Bonsoir, good to see you too. I hope it's the beginning of the world, at least in Brazil, after these elections.
All right, we'll get to that. Don't worry. You can listen, like, and subscribe to The World This Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. They had a little party in Moscow this Friday. Vladimir Putin with Moscow's 4 proxy leaders of eastern Ukraine provinces annexed this Friday in a ceremony at the Kremlin for the Russian president. It's not mission accomplished, but rather no going back in a war directed at both Ukraine and the West.
But the people of these 4 territories have made their choice, have made their decision, and there's no turning back. Russia will not let them down.
And the signing followed by celebrations, a pop concert on Red Square to celebrate, where we also had another speech by Vladimir Putin, Vivian Walt, where he reclaimed as his own the old slogan from during World War II, Russia's victory will be ours.
You know, you called it a party today, and it sort of, in some ways, has more of a sort of pantomime feel to it. It's theatre, and it's theatre that the rest of the world does not take seriously at all. So the entire, effort to wrap himself in the whole glory of Russia as a kind of, fighting the fascists is really all he has had for the past year. And it has not gone very well for him. And particularly the last few weeks have not gone very well for him. It does seem more like an act of desperation than an act of any kind of mission accomplished.
You say that the rest of the world doesn't take it seriously, but we're talking about a nuclear-armed power here.
That's true. But if one had to kind of think through the logic of Putin daring to use any kind of a nuclear attack, whether it be tactical or strategic, he would certainly lose whatever alliance he possibly has left with President Xi, or any other or India, for that matter, one of his great, clients at the moment for energy.
Catherine Norris-Trent, your thoughts when you looked at those images of Vladimir Putin addressing the crowd on Red Square?
Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable, isn't it? And, Putin has very much been on the back foot in recent weeks with these very humiliating military defeats on the battlefield. So it's just really hard not to read that as, well, trying to make some kind of statement to his people to gain back some positivity. And also, maybe trying to frighten the Ukrainians into to somehow agreeing to freeze the lines of the conflict as they are, which he would very much like to claim as a victory. I mean, clearly that not going to happen as far as the Ukrainians are concerned. They say they're going to keep on fighting and just ignore this. It's just fascinating from a psychological point of view as well. We're all trying to work out what is going on in his head. How far will he go? The nuclear question is absolutely fascinating. We've been talking about it today a lot in the newsroom. I'm preparing to go to Ukraine myself on another trip. And so this question of, could he actually do it? And of course, no one knows. But then a lot of people didn't think he was going to attack Kyiv or do a full-scale invasion of Ukraine back in February. So honestly, we could go anywhere. This is kind of a line now, a marker that has been put down, and there's no going back from there. You
ask how far Vladimir Putin will go. There is this stark contrast between the scenes on Red Square and the bloodiest attack on Ukrainian civilians in weeks at least 25 killed in the shelling of a car park where a convoy of families was assembling to try and cross into Russian-held territory near Zaporizhzhia. That's in the center east of the country. They wanted to see loved ones. One checkpoint in the area had been opened in recent days, allowing citizens to cross the front. And, you know, before I ask you about what's going on the battlefield, Alexander Querry, when you think of Zaporizhzhia, do you agree with Vivian Walt that nobody takes it seriously when there's that party on Red Square?
Well, of course, nobody takes it seriously. I think at the moment, Ukrainians are actually too busy really fighting on the ground against Russians than, you know, taking, you know, too much of their time to give attention to Vladimir Putin. They know that these referendums are sham referendums. That everybody knows that. I mean, 90% plus. We've all seen how it went. We have reports of people who reported how soldiers were coming, you know, door to door and basically telling them where to tick with the muzzle of a gun. So obviously, no one takes it seriously. What's interesting with the Zaporizhzhia attack, it's the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. As far as I know, Zaporizhzhia Oblast is supposedly have been annexed, so to speak, at least by Russia today. So does that mean that the Kremlin bombs its own territory? It says a lot. It says a lot about the Kremlin, and it says a lot about Moscow's behavior even when it comes to Vladimir Putin's so-called annexation. Even when he does that, he can't help himself. The Kremlin or Moscow can't help themselves rather than just by destroying a population which is allegedly under their control. I'm saying allegedly because indeed, of course,
because we're showing Alexander a map of the areas controlled by the Russians, and on that map you can see what are the administrative borders of those eastern regions. They don't correspond. I know for Zaporizhzhia's case, what is it, the city of Melitopol, which for now will be the administrative head in the Russian-held parts. How do you read it? Does he lay claim to parts that are not under his control?
Yes, he does. He doesn't control part of the Kherson Oblast. He doesn't control much of the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. And, if the Ukrainians continue their counteroffensive, at one point they're going to enter the Luhansk Oblast, which he claims to have annexed. So, I mean, he sort of redesigned it. It's actually, well, you used the word fascinating about the nuclear attack. From where we stand in Kharkiv, I wouldn't call it fascinating, to be entirely honest. But what's fascinating indeed is the complete the parallel reality in which he lives in. Just by signing a piece of paper, he thinks that he controls whatever, you know, he signs, which is absolutely not the case at all. Zaporizhzhia Oblast is named after Zaporizhzhia. He doesn't control Zaporizhzhia. So it's a complete fantasy, and Ukrainians, the problem is that it would be funny if it wasn't so tragic, because it's an extremely destructive fantasy, and it's a fantasy that indeed is linked to his nuclear threat. Now, I just want to come back to this nuclear threat. He sort of tries to, I mean, the reports from the Kremlin are sort of try to calm down, you know, it's on the lie, saying they could use a small tactical nuclear weapon, still a nuclear weapon at the end of the day. So yeah, I think to come back to it, it's the matter is indeed what's in his head and what kind of reality he's trying to do by carving some sort of very fantasized control, because again, he has no control whatsoever on what's happening on the ground.
By the way, the land controlled by the Russians on that map is shrinking. Kyiv claims that Moscow's forces are, for all intent and purposes, surrounded in the frontline Donetsk city of Liman. And we had that contrast earlier, Jamil Shad, where you had Vladimir Putin addressing the crowd on Red Square, saying, congratulations, you've shown Russia is strong. And the NATO Secretary General in Brussels stating that all this shows how much Russia is weak. Let me ask you, you know, this is the same Russia that was part of that big club that Brazil is in, of the BRICS, of these emerging giants. What are the views in Brazil on all this?
Francois, that's a very good question, especially because, for example, trade between Brazil and Russia more than doubled since the beginning of the war. But not only that, the BRICS countries have taken a position of maintaining dialogue with Russia, some claiming that this could be a way of maintaining some kind of negotiations. But honestly, it seems much more convenient answer than anything real. Now, what worries me, especially here at the UN, is the absolute collapse of any channel of communications between the West and Russia. And not only because of the war, and only on issues of the war, especially on other issues that will have to be dealt. For example, climate change, human rights, the issue of disarmament. At this point of time, absolutely all dossiers at the UN are frozen because there's simply no way of getting the West and Russia with its allies to actually talk.
But we do have conversations. We know that the French president, the German chancellor, they've been speaking of Vladimir Putin.
Yes, but with no result, with no actual plan, with no envisaged timeline for a ceasefire. Even Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, made it very clear that he would create an illusion if he would talk about a ceasefire at this moment. I have seen here in Geneva at the UN several of the meetings, technical meetings sometimes, that have absolutely collapsed in the last month or so, because there's absolutely no way that Russia and its allies on the other side, the West, can actually agree on absolutely anything at this point of time.
We heard the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky earlier stating that he's willing to talk with Russia, but not with this Russian president. Ukraine's president, who's been urging Russian draftees to surrender, this week has seen fighting-age Russians run for the borders of Europe, Central Asia, even Mongolia. These images from near the Georgian border. Reaction on the other side, well, it's been mixed. Some welcoming the asylum seekers, others arguing that Russians should be resisting at home. Finland has now closed its borders to Russian tourist visa holders.
The government has just taken a decision to severely restrict tourist travel by Russians. The restrictions will come into force tomorrow, Friday, and remain until further notice. The decision aims to completely prevent the current situation of Russian tourism to Finland and related transit through the country.
Vivian Walt, how should the EU, for instance, handle Russians who don't want to fight and who want to leave?
I think they should welcome them in, as many as possible. Firstly, if you're just talking about the EU's own selfish interests, you are likely getting, the most educated, most well-resourced young men of the country fleeing. These are people with the resources who can make it across the border. And secondly, it's deeply demoralizing for the Russians to see 200,000 people leaving within a matter of weeks. So I don't think the EU should hold back one bit. And in terms of Russia, this really is the moment at which the war comes home. For 7 months, it's been remote. It's been something on television for 99% of Russians. And suddenly it is really in your home and in your neighborhood and in your building and in your family. And that, I think, is a very, very different kind of thing.
Alexander Query, I know where you are in Ukraine. They don't feel the same way about welcoming Russians. They say, why didn't you resist earlier?
So, first, two things here. I think if we talk about the EU has indeed different members in there, and you can hardly say to Estonia, to Latvia, to Lithuania, and Finland, who are really facing actually these populations of Russia, and Russians who actually misbehave a lot, and who have a political agenda, a strong political agenda against the EU, to welcome them with open arms. Like, there is a reality on the ground for this country. country which is not the same than for Western countries indeed, and we should not forget that when we talk about how different countries oppose tourist visa ban or not. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, of course, this for Ukrainians, this discourse, this type of speech is absolutely unacceptable to hear, because there is this idea that, just one thing, the protests we saw, these are not protests against the war. These are not protests against the massacres of Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol. These are protests against mobilization. You said the war is coming home. Indeed, it becomes an issue when it comes home, when it touches them personally. But when it comes to information, it's not like if we say that, let's say, the educated Russians, so that means that these educated Russians had access somehow to information. So if they had access somehow to information, it means they know about what happens in Ukraine, what happened in Ukraine since 2014, since February 24. They saw the images of Bucha. I'm genuinely curious about how statistically how many of these Russians who are fleeing right now were actually happy to put a laughing emoji under certain images coming from Ukraine and Russian Telegram channels. So we should be very careful with that when it comes to let's say imagining that simply because they're fleeing mobilization and they're actually running away from the reality of the war, that they are against the war. They're not against the war, they're against mobilization. And it's a really completely different thing. And we have also, and I understand personally, that Estonia is being careful with welcoming too many Russians, because we also saw numerous reports and numerous sort of Telegram channel messages on Telegram channels with certain pro-military channels asking for Russians to create civil unrest in Europe. So I think from the point of view of certain states, I'm thinking Baltic states, Poland, etc., etc.
The frontline states.
There's wariness. There's a wariness over this sort of exodus.
Yeah, and when Vladimir Putin says no going back, it comes in a week where it's all coming to a head. Mobilization, the referendum, and the explosions that took out the currently offline Nord Stream pipelines. Pipelines hit, according to the Danes, by the equivalent of hundreds of kilos of TNT. All sides point to sabotage. In whose interest is it to blow up the natural gas link between Russia and Germany? Catherine Norris-Trent, you have the answer.
Oh, right. Yeah, I've done the investigation. 90 meters down already. No, I mean, this is something that's going to take a long time, if ever, to be completely, physically proven. It's one of the very interesting parts of this. I mean, and how this was done. Was it, distance activated mines? Was it underwater drones? It's actually really interesting when you look into the technical side of this, because, there are ways in which boat traffic, can be mapped and detected. So this is going to be...
you can't throw just a dynamite stick out of a rowboat for this one.
Right, exactly. It was a very carefully planned, I'm sure, operation. Look, I mean, a lot of people saying this is Russia, of course.
And we heard the Russian president saying sanctions are not enough for Anglo-Saxons. They switched to sabotage.
Right, of course. So it's this parallel reality we were talking about earlier. It's this kind of flipping the mirror and creating confusion, creating disinformation. It could very well be the Russians saying, look, we can do this as well. We can do this damage. Look what we can do. And on the other hand, it is their pipeline that they're destroying. So I think this is about saying, maybe even stepping back from the nuclear threat by saying we can do other damage too, and as a way of getting around the fact that maybe they're not going to use the nukes. They can do other kinds of damage. They can damage other infrastructure. There's all kinds of vulnerability. There are other pipelines in the area, and
internet.
95% of international digital data is in undersea cables. There's all kinds of
in
chaos
the West
that could be thrown.
Yeah.
So we're entering a new age, Jamil Shad, of hybrid warfare. Again, in whose interest is all of this?
That is it. That is the great question. And I do agree with what was just said. Other vulnerabilities can be explored, especially related to the fact that for so many years, Europe built basically a network of relationships with Russia that now obviously can be used in another way. My question, and basically not only related to the pipelines, but in more general terms, is basically what are the limits? If nuclear weapons are off the table and mainly being used as a threat, what else is there? What else can be done to harm not only the relationship, because that is already torn apart, but especially the link between Russia and the European countries at the moment.
All right, and we had on the day that Germany rolled out a 200 billion euro energy subsidy plan for consumers and businesses, the finance minister employing blunt language in the context of what happened in the Baltic Sea.
We are in an energy war for prosperity and freedom. After the sabotage by a yet unknown actor in the Baltic Sea, the situation has become even worse.
Do you agree with that, Vivian Walt? We're in an energy war. I mean, using the term war is strong. Are we at war?
I mean, if it's an energy war, in some ways, it's a war of Europe's own making. It did, as Jamil just said, create this entire kind of web of dependency relationships with Russia. And I think that for now, I mean, it seems somewhat optimistic. I think even a few weeks ago, we were way more pessimistic about what was going to happen in the winter and, you know, was Europe going to freeze and so on. It does seem like the stockpiles are, you know, relatively stable now. I think what's much more worrying, actually, is the other kinds of wars, and Jamil touched on it. And, you know, that is, you know, what other damage could be done? We just spoke about the undersea cables that carry 95% of the West's internet communications. I mean, that would be essentially devastating. And I think when the Germans talk about an energy war, everything we're talking about, really, you have to ask yourself, what is the future of the UN and the Security Council? You have one of the 5 permanent members that's essentially gone rogue. And there doesn't seem to be a mechanism in which we can kind of right-size the world again, quite under the structure.
In the interim, Europe's going to have to steel itself this winter. Here in France, there's talk of mandatory measures if the French don't watch their energy consumption. Just this Friday, we had EU ministers agreeing on plans. There you see in this tweet, France's finance minister taking a snap of himself in a turtleneck sweater. No comment necessary. While the prime minister, well, she sported a puffy jacket while visiting a car parts new hydrogen tank factory north of Paris Wednesday. Your thoughts on the messaging here from the French government?
Slightly clumsy messaging, which has come in for quite a lot of derision.
Clumsy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like they're trying to say to people, look what we do, and then people are saying, you know, let them wear cashmere. You know, they're wearing these very glamorous clothes, but they're trying to send home the message to the French people as in, look, you're going to have to get used to this. You're going to have to deal with it. Prepare yourself. Make sacrifices. We're doing it too. That's clearly the messaging. I don't know if it's working yet at this stage. Honestly, like I've already heard quite a lot of people in Paris complaining because certain swimming pools are closed down to save energy, and people are unhappy about that. This is just the beginning, and I don't know how much French public opinion or in other European countries is going to accept sacrifices. They're not psychologically prepared in many ways to do so yet, I don't believe.
Alexander Query, when you're sitting in Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, where winter's going to be a lot more brutal than it is here, do you tell yourself that your compatriots are a little too soft?
No. Well, I'm wearing a turtleneck myself. I won't say turtleneck. But no, I think what is interesting here, it's not about French people being too soft. I don't really agree on the fact that compare sacrifices here, because of course we see certain images, but in the most vulnerable population of France, actually they're going to face the same issue than in Ukraine, which is if you can't, pay your bill, you don't have any gas at the end of the month. So it's hard to compare here. I think I just want to come back to this idea of an energy war a little bit. Ukraine has been, and Ukrainian governments, not only Zelensky before, has been warning over and over and over again the West, saying, and I remember it was, if I'm not wrong, in 2024 or something like that, there was already issues between Gazprom, between Ukraine, that led to a cut of gas here. So Ukraine is used to that kind of dependency. It's used to Russia's blackmail, to put it bluntly. Now, when it comes to the ground, Ukraine try to find solutions. The first solution is actually, at the moment, the priority is isolating houses. Why? Because of the
insulating houses.
Because insulating, yes. Because of the shellings, most of the windows are gone. So knowing the winters, especially in eastern Ukraine, which can be quite rough, Ukrainians have to face the main priority right now is getting heating back and also insulating houses. And basically, they have to reinvent low consumption because they're obliged to do so. And I recently talked to the CEO of Naftogaz, which is Ukraine's state monopoly. What they try to do is also diversify as much as possible the source of energy, so Ukraine wouldn't rely entirely and only on gas. So diversification right now for Ukraine is the key. So they're turning to biomethane, to wood, coal, you name it. But they took this issue extremely seriously. Actually, they began taking it seriously since June. Actually, the summer only started, and they're already thinking about the upcoming winter because they know that it's going to be a very harsh winter in Ukraine. So I wouldn't say that my compatriots are softer, but I also do believe that some countries in Western Europe could learn from the knowledge on how to deal with difficult situations, especially when it comes to energy from Ukraine.
Diversifying your energy mix, getting back to France for a moment, for small businesses, well, it's already crunch time when they look at their heating and utility bills. Bakeries, some of them are on the brink. Restaurants rewriting the menus to keep the costs down for customers.
Cod is very expensive because it's scarce. Now we're offering a fillet of sea bream, one per person, with vegetables and sauce.
Today we pay more bills each month than we did a year ago, or even at the start of the year. But we made savings on some products and we raised our prices a little. That enables us to live daily.
Jamil Chad, you who can see France from your window there in Geneva, your thoughts when you hear that the French are downscaling the fish on offer on the menu?
Well, the price of this war will be very high to different levels, first to the governments, but also to society and companies, basically. So this will be a war that will have a price tag on it, that's for sure. Now, the issue is that it's not only an European war. Well, it is an European war, but with an impact elsewhere around the world as well. So you have an impact in Africa, you have an impact in South America, for example, with countries that are dependent on fertilizers from Russia. So basically, as you can see, this is a war that is being fought in Ukraine, but that it has, for sure, a global impact. I can just imagine, for example, not only the readjustments in Europe, but for example, if South American countries such as Brazil, Argentina, and others don't get their fertilizers, what will happen to the ag production, to the agriculture production and exports in 2023, which will add basically to the increase of prices of food everywhere in the world. So as you see, the links are very, very dangerous, and the impact is very widespread.
Impact widespread. And as for Britain, where utility bills have soared the most of leading European economies, well, there's good news and bad news. The good news is subjects of His Gracious Majesty can enjoy, hot from the mint, the first coins with the effigy of their new king. That's the good news. The bad news, their dwindling value. what with the pound's biggest slump in decades. It all started last Friday when the brand new Prime Minister's Chancellor of the Exchequer announced tax cuts for the rich that are set to explode the deficit after the International Monetary Fund made a rare intervention urging Liz Truss to reverse course. The PM then broke her nearly week-long silence with a tour of local BBC radio affiliates that didn't quite go to script, like when she tried to play the Putin card.
We have a very, very difficult economic global situation because of the war that Vladimir Putin has perpetrated in Ukraine. And countries are under pressure around the world.
This isn't Putin. This isn't just about Putin. I mean, your Chancellor on Friday opened up the stable door and spooked the horses so much you can almost see the economy being dragged behind them.
Gotta say, British journalists really give it to them.
And British local journalists, this was a really fascinating part of this, because Liz Truss didn't do the big flagship BBC national radio programme. Some would say because she was hiding from what they considered was going to be a bit of a pummeling. So she went on this 5-minute tour around BBC regional radio stations, and she got lacerated. It was almost painful to listen to. She was just taken to task right from the get-go. They knew they only had 5 minutes each, so they just did not pull any punches, and people were asking her where she'd been, whether she could sleep at night. She talked about inflation, and they cut in and said, "You're making it worse." She had big silences. She could not manage this communication. So I think it really backfired as a communication strategy. Liz Truss is, how can I put this kindly? She's not a great communicator at the best of times, but this was, it just didn't reassure the markets at all. It sent them further down. So people are actually asking now how long Liz Truss can hold on, and some Conservative MPs are reported to already be sending in the famous letters to the backbench 1922
Yeah, but they've
committee.
just done that. They can't do it again.
They can't do it again. But she has, she promised during the leadership campaign, she put out this tweet with a gaffe saying that she would hit the ground instead of hit the ground running, and she kind of just has crashed into the ground right from the get-go. I mean, with a brief pause to mark the Queen's death and the funeral on the mourning period, and then they've gone right in there. And there are opinion polls showing that the Labour are, some of them, 30% ahead in the opinion polls. Now, clearly that will get less, and it just seems like the next election is Labour's to lose, which, of course, I'm sure they're very capable of doing.
Snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Bucking the trend, Britain's largest selling tabloid, the Daily Mail, this Friday, channeling Margaret Thatcher, who once famously stated, "The lady's not for turning." There you see the headline, "Truss, I'm not for turning." Unfortunately, that's just the cover. If you turn to page 8, the same newspaper reports lenders pull mortgages as house sales collapse, Vivian Walt.
It's just amazing. One has to remember that Margaret Thatcher had...
It's because for them, it's not funny. For the people who's going to see their interest rates
and
now.
Conservative voters are the mortgage holders, the mortgage owners. This is the core of their vote. Sorry.
And, aside from the fact that Liz Truss is clearly a kind of unabashed admirer of Margaret Thatcher, it must remind a lot of Brits of that time, which was really a terribly difficult time economically. It has to be said also that Margaret Thatcher had the Falklands War, which, gave her a great sort of momentum and support. And Liz Truss has none of that. And she's coming in after the last few years of basically upheaval in Britain. And she was supposed to be the stabilizing force, and she's been yet another show of upheaval. So it does not look good.
Why is she doubling down?
I don't think she... Well, I was thinking about this, and I was sort of wondering if there's something in being a woman leader that makes her particularly driven to kind of stand her ground, and, the lady's not for turning, the lady's not for being pushed around by a whole lot of guys
or is it populism in 2022? You realize that she saw Boris Johnson try to push the envelope when it came to pushing the other institutions, Parliament, the bureaucracy.
She saw him being not conservative enough for her liking and for the liking of a lot of the right wing in the British Conservative Party, not being pure enough, like having a big state. Liz Truss is an ideologist. So this is part of ideology. She's believed for a very long time in a small state, in ultra-liberal economics. And now she's in power. She's just decided to do it despite any of the context. Despite the fact that energy bills are soaring through the roof. They're just ploughing ahead with it.
Jamil Shad, people are comparing the UK to Argentina in terms of populist politics, don't care about the deficits, and that's spooking the markets.
Yes, I would say welcome to Latin America, but I'm not going to be that harsh. The reality is that obviously you have a situation that populism does not solve problems such as budget, such as deficits, such as a plan for mortgage owners. Populism is a shortcut in most of the time with solutions that are actually illusions. From what I'm hearing, from what you're saying, it does look like very much a situation that we have lived in South America for some time. The problem is that obviously the electoral period always makes these politicians, or at least these parties, to look for a quick fix or, as I'm insisting, illusions. These illusions are not going to get things done.
All right, and you heard Catherine earlier alluding to that latest YouGov poll for the Times of London. It shows a shocking drop in support for the Conservatives. Yeah, you see the end of that graph. That's not an error. That's how much the support in blue there for the Conservatives. Some estimates putting the Tories on its worst route in decades should an election be held tomorrow, which it's not. What is particularly amazing is that despite the national unity around the Queen's death, Liz Truss has not enjoyed the usual grace period for new prime ministers. There you see comparison with Boris Johnson and Theresa May when they entered office in terms of popularity. Again, Alexander Query, is this a story about politics in 2022?
Well, I suppose it is a story of politics in 2022. I mean, I have to admit we're a little bit far from it, from where I stand. But I would like to point out the fact of Liz Truss playing the Putin card. Indeed, it can be, I suppose, it can be helpful to a certain extent to explain, budgets, expenses, etc., etc. The problem is, and we can notice that now in France, we can notice that in a lot of Western countries, the more governments try to play Ukraine's card, it actually has a perverted effort, because people begin to think, oh, I'm paying too much for energy, that's because of Ukraine. So the support for Ukraine drops. So at the end of the day, it's quite counterproductive. So putting everything on the back of Russia's war in Ukraine actually destroys, at the end of the day, the support for Ukraine, because of course it's winter and people are going to be more interested into, paying their bills. And after 7 months of war, it's sort of logical. So I would say that to a certain extent, this card worked with Boris Johnson, but maybe it's a bit more complex to play when you're Liz Truss.
With winter coming. It's been bruising. Speaking of bruising politics, will it be one round or two in Brazil? Citizens vote Sunday in presidential elections with the incumbent facing an uphill battle. 10 challengers for Jair Bolsonaro. But it's one who looms large for the far-right former army captain, his left-wing predecessor Lula Inácio da Silva. It's gotten ugly in the final candidates' debate. They traded taunts on Thursday evening.
I'm going to make a decree and sign it so that we find out what this man wants to hide for 100 years. I'm going to stop here because I want the other candidates to participate in the debate. But, Mr. President, when you get to the podium, please lie less.
The ex-convict Lula says that I decreed the secrecy of my family. Which decree? Give me the decree number. He says I delayed the purchase of vaccines. No country in the world bought a vaccine in 2020. Stop lying. When you talk about hunger, I gave 600 reais in aid to our citizens. You gave very little to the poor. You just used the poor as a way to win votes.
Jamil Shad, that's just a tiny sample of what viewers saw Thursday evening in Brazil. Is this normal, this kind of debate there?
Well, became very normal because you have on one side a president that has destroyed the law, threatened, has lied over and over and over, that is attacking the press in a daily basis. For example, what he mentioned about the vaccines, he says that he hasn't taken the vaccine yet, and he did delay every single moment that he could buying the vaccines. I'm here in Geneva. I reported firsthand how Brazil did not take part on the COVAX initiative in the beginning because they were not on board on anything related to immunization. So as you can see, he was once again lying. And to complete all of this, he has declared 100 years of secrecy on most of his decisions, which obviously it's an absurd if you're talking about a democracy.
And will it be one round or two?
Well, it's a very difficult call at this moment. Lula has 50%, that at least the intention of votes, according to the latest polls. But obviously, this is a very, very uncertain moment. Violence, political violence, is threatening people going to the polls. So actually, it's a very hard call at this moment. Let's wait until Sunday.
And the trouble could come if they're between the two rounds of the presidential election.
Absolutely. And Bolsonaro, who is a great admirer of Trump, as we've known for years, has already basically been following the kind of playbook of the Trump 2020 campaign. You know, the election's going to be full of vote rigging and you can't trust the results. And so even if Lula does come out with 50% and avoids a runoff election in theory, there's really, every chance that Bolsonaro will not accept that. And you'll have a kind of Trump situation.
And making headlines is a certain TikTok endorsement for Bolsonaro. Star Paris Saint-Germain Brazil striker Neymar dancing to a song that's a campaign favorite of the incumbent. Neymar, by the way, hitting back at critics of this over Twitter. He said, people talk about democracy and a lot of things, but when someone has a different opinion, they're attacked by the very people who talk about democracy. Go figure. Jamil Chad, can you explain to us why Neymar is going public with the endorsement of Bolsonaro?
Two elements there, Francois. Political illiteracy, and secondly, the tax breaks he got from the government. He negotiated these tax breaks with the government. So, as he said, figure that out.
All right. Your thoughts on that, Catherine Nordstrom?
Well, the whole election campaign, really reminds me of Trump 2020. And indeed, the debates there looked like a clip from Clinton-Trump. It was so bruising and just so personal. But all the stories we've talked about tonight are really tapping into this kind of post-truth world that we're living in. The lies, the illusions, politicians just saying things that are blatantly untrue, not representing reality, and how widely that is believed or not. And it's incredibly scary how widespread it is, from Brazil to Russia to the UK. We are just well and truly in this post-truth world, and I don't necessarily see how we get out of that, and that's terrifying.
All right, George Orwell would certainly have things to say about it. Catherine Norris-Trent, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Vivian Walt, Jamil Chad for being with us from Geneva, Alexander Query from Kharkiv in Ukraine. Thank you. Thanks to all of you watching. Thanks for being with us here in The World This Week.